The last big struggle of the sort that we're seeing today ended 600, 700, 800 years ago, which was the battle between church and state. And now you may think, well, that was a battle between philosophies, or it was a battle about theology versus, politics. But that's not what it was. It was an economic battle. It was a battle over who controlled the ability to tax, who controlled the waterways, who controlled the fields, who was able to determine who got to put a mill where they wanted to put a mill. And it was two different systems for divvying up money and power, because those two things go together. When that battle was resolved, however, something interesting happened. A new actor entered the stage, because the nation states that were just budding up at that time wanted to build their economic power, and they created corporations, which they empowered to serve the state. And in this earliest incarnation, that was the idea, that the corporation would go out, it would collect money from doing whatever it was doing, usually trading. Although in the case of one corporation, which I followed particularly closely in this book, which is the oldest corporation still in existence today, now called Stora Enso, once called Stora Kopparberg, which was a copper company that was born in Sweden in Viking times. The idea was that these enterprises could produce revenue that would go into state treasuries and enable the states to be stronger. And I follow the story, and I sort of say, well, where did things evolve so that we got to the point that we're in today? One thing that you discover is that fairly early on in the history of corporations, you got struggles like you've seen today. And in fact, in the early part of the 18th century, there was something called the South Sea Island Bubble. And the South Sea Island Bubble was a scheme, a company that was created, and shares in the company were sold in the United Kingdom to go and sort of develop these islands in the South Pacific. And the bubble blew up. And a lot of people went broke. And there was a lot of finger pointing. And if you go into the paper from those days, you don't have to do that because it's in the book. But if you go in and you read this stuff, you will see articles that sound like they were torn out of the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal from right now. That Parliament was corrupted, that Parliament was bought, that corporations were had a bigger voice in things than was fair to the average citizen. And whenever there's a bubble, there's this same kind of debate. But something interesting also happens in the context of that. There's a bubble, there's this same kind of debate. Do corporations get their power reined in? They don't. It gets pulled back a little, and gradually more is acquired. And the one country that has done the most to empower corporations to a point where the power as it exists today is sort of hard to control was the United States. Because we were born with the Industrial Revolution. 1776 was not just the first date of the American Revolution. It was also the date of the first patents that James Watt got on the steam engine. So the United States was sort of born of the industrial era, and it was born of a debate over what the shape of that country should be. And even in the earliest days, our forefathers, Thomas Jefferson, for example, warned that corporations, great corporations, would have too much power. He wasn't alone, by the way. Jefferson said it, Lincoln said it, Theodore Roosevelt said it, Franklin Roosevelt said it, Woodrow Wilson said it, presidents throughout history, Louis Brandeis said it. They were worried that too much power would become undemocratic, that it would undermine the ideals of this government. But somehow, those with power got these ideas institutionalized. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a case about Dartmouth College, which would seem to have not much to do with corporate history. But what happened was that a charter was given, and the state wanted to take the charter away. And it was brought to the Supreme Court, where one of the people arguing the case was Daniel Webster, and they had a debate and determined that once a state gives a charter, it can't take it away. And what did that mean? Essentially, it meant that these corporations, designed to be immortal, right? That's the whole idea of having a corporation, is it outlives people, now was starting to acquire a kind of immunity once it sort of left the womb of government. Next, big turning point was there was civil war in the United States, and the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War to ensure that African Americans who had been slaves would have the rights of other people, and that was the purpose. But in the first 50 years of the 14th Amendment being in operation, most of the cases brought for the Supreme Court using it were by corporations seeking to ensure that they would have the same rights as people. So, this Mitt Romney comment, corporations are people, it seems like a kind of a glib comment, but it's actually not. It's a core concept.